Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be presenting on behalf of this team that's worked so hard to produce this product. And a special thank you to our advisor, Kizzy Charles Guzman. So our project is actually working with Columbia University, and we worked with Columbia to develop strategies for tracking and reducing their Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. Specifically, we worked with the Office of Environmental Stewardship, and that is our client. So throughout the presentation, I'll walk through it with a description of why this project is so important to the university, our project goals. I'll talk through our approach, and then I'll talk about some of the recommendations that we made for the university, and I'll wrap up with some conclusions. So as all of you may know, Columbia has a sustainability plan called Plan 2030. And within their plan, they are committed to reducing their own greenhouse gas emissions. And they are also reporting their greenhouse gas emissions to the climate registry. They currently report Scope 1, Scope 2, and some of the Scope 3 emissions. So the emissions that they report under Scope 3 are employee commuting, business travel, and waste from operations. So they'd like to expand this reporting to include more of Scope 3, which is emissions from freight transportation to the university. And specifically, we're talking about deliveries via truck that come to the campuses across the university. So you could imagine that given the number of vendors that Columbia has, this is a very broad and complex project. And also, there would be a lot of partners involved to actually tracking and reporting and reducing emissions. So we started our project by trying to understand what others were doing in this space. We talked to 9 different universities that were similar to Columbia and 3 different corporations. And all of these organizations are focused on Scope 3 and are thinking about reducing their freight emissions. You can see some of the universities that we talked to pictured here on the left. And we also looked at some reporting guidance documents. Specifically, we looked at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Global Logistics Emissions Council, which are 2 guidance documents that can direct Columbia on how to calculate and then ultimately report their Scope 3 emissions. So after doing our research and our interviews, we came up with 15 different recommendations for the Office of Environmental Stewardship, and they generally fall into these 4 categories. So the categories are procurement practices, community behavior, Columbia operations, and activities within the Office of Environmental Stewardship itself. So in the context of the rest of the recommendations, I'd like to present one of the findings from one of our top vendors, which is Staples. So Staples is one of the vendors that Columbia University works the most with. They see over 4,600 deliveries only last year. They have 1,000 users that have the authority to order products from Staples. So this system that they have with Staples is very decentralized, and there's a lot of volume coming from Staples. So the first set of recommendations are procurement practices. And the theory behind this is that if you can manage what you order in a different way, we can actually reduce the orders, consolidate deliveries, and then ultimately reduce freight emissions. So we recommend that the university work with vendors to start to consolidate orders. So in the context of Staples, Staples is also interested in reducing their own greenhouse gas emissions, and they have an Excel-based tool that they can help their clients with in looking at how they can reorder and reorganize the way that they make deliveries so that there are fewer deliveries to campus. So we recommend that the university work with Staples and other similar vendors to come up with solutions similar to that. The second practice that we looked into were green contracts. So this is a process by which when Columbia has a contract with a specific vendor, they can require the vendor to have certain sustainability practices to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. So for instance, the university could require vendors to supply data on their travel, fuel use, distance, weight, things that they might not normally provide to the university. And by doing that, the university can now calculate greenhouse gas emissions under Scope 3. So the second set of recommendations is for the university operations. One of the things that we found was that when visiting certain parts of the campus, we noticed that whenever there was a delivery zone, sometimes there would be a truck that would come up right next to the loading zone and not actually park in the loading zone. They would leave the vehicle on. There'd be emissions just from operating vehicles that way while they were taking the boxes out of the trucks. We propose that the university begin to enforce delivery zone rules more regularly so that we can prevent that action from happening within the boundaries of the university itself. The third set of recommendations is community behavior. So this set of recommendations really deals with the fact that there are certain procurement practices throughout the university that authorized purchasers have that aren't exactly keeping freight emissions in mind. So we think that if we have some educational videos or materials, we can help people understand the relationship between ordering practices and freight emissions. And by doing that, they can have different practices such as ordering bulk deliveries or maybe taking actions to not order at all. Finally, we have a recommendation for the Office of Environmental Stewardship, and this recommendation is to utilize a calculation guide that this team prepared for this office. So the purpose of the calculation guide is really to use the available data from vendors to calculate last mile delivery. And the purpose of the last mile delivery is to set a boundary. So the boundary would be from the distribution center to the university itself. This calculation approach is very powerful because it is very flexible based on the type of data that we can get from vendors. So we can get either fuel data, the data of how much money they spent during the trip, or distance and weight data. And this types of data can be used to calculate their greenhouse gas emissions. So we'd like to walk through the calculation framework with you with using our example from Staples. It's a three-step process where a vendor would answer a questionnaire. And we learned from Staples that there were over 4,600 deliveries in 2021. They have 2 distribution centers in Montgomery, New York and Putnam, Connecticut, and they use diesel-fueled heavy-duty trucks. So this information is all used to calculate how many gallons of fuel are used during the whole year, which was 87,500. We applied the appropriate emissions factor to this number, and we came up with a value of 900 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. And just to put that into perspective, that is about 900 round trip flights from New York to London. So given all the information that we learned from the questionnaire and our calculations, we presented some recommendations to the Office of Environmental Stewardship, and they included having a higher minimum spend. So this recommendation would really be to increase the minimum spend, which is currently $35, to a higher number so that we can actually order more at one time and have fewer deliveries to go along with consolidated deliveries. And then we would also want to formalize a data tracking procedure with Staples so that at a certain frequency, Staples could provide the university with exactly how much fuel they've been using over the course of 3 months, 6 months, every year. So we feel that with all of these processes, we'll be able to accurately come up with a value to track and emissions from Staples. So we realize that some of the recommendations that we're proposing are difficult and new, and we've come up with a few challenges that the university might face. The first challenge is data collection. So as you can see, there's a lot of data that would need to be collected to calculate Scope 3 emissions, and we would really need to rely on vendors to provide that data. Plus, if you think about the number of vendors that we're working with, this is a very broad and complex task. Secondly, we also would need participation from the university itself. Sometimes procurement practices are sort of deeply ingrained in office culture, and there is that education piece and also that piece where people need to respond to the new information they've heard. And then finally, We have some next steps that we'd like to recommend as well. We think that the first step for the Office of Environmental Stewardship would be to work with purchasing to understand who their key vendors are. One approach would be to understand how much money is spent in a contract with a vendor and sort of rank those vendors to understand where they should begin their work. And then finally, knowing that we're recommending just the last mile calculation, we feel in the long run, once we have all the data and all the relationships with the vendors, we feel that we can expand beyond just the last mile and include the whole scope 3 inventory upstream to cradle. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, great presentation. I'm wondering if in your research, beyond just measuring these emissions, if you all saw ways that vendors could reduce emissions from these vehicles, since I know that with diesel heavy use vehicles, there aren't a lot of opportunities to fuel switch or electrify them yet. So what vendors would do to reduce them?
Yeah, we couldn't really talk to many vendors outside of Staples, but some of the electrification suggestions that came from other universities were using e-bikes around campus. So if you're getting a mail delivery at a certain location and you have to bring it to someone to their desk, you might want to use an e-bike within the campus itself. Some vendors probably could consider using electric vehicles or low emission vehicles sort of in that last mile when they're delivering to campus.
Thank you.
Hi, fantastic presentation. I thought it was very clear and engaging. I'm wondering if the team has estimated like a percentage or amount of emissions reduction that would come from all this recommendation, or if the team has collaborated with Columbia to set a target for, say, by 2030. We're hoping with these, strategies, we're hoping to reduce X and X percentage of emissions for coming from freight.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And the tricky thing with scope 3 is that there are so many vendors to work with, and each vendor is going to have a unique process to calculate their GHG emissions. So it's tough to really say overall, we're going to reduce these emissions by a certain date. We do recommend to the university that by 2030, they sort of take action on the green contracts, contacting those high hitting vendors and establishing those relationships so they can begin to start their baseline. And so in the future, they'll be able to start those reduction strategies.